Welcome to today's Religion Media Centre briefing, which is on values in public life. And all around us in the press, we're waiting for the Sue Gray report into parties at number 10 to be published. And we know it's been finished, but the latest is it's not going to be published till next week now because it's going through a process of checking. But we do know that on the back of the report, the Met Police have launched an investigation into potential breaches of the COVID-19 laws and restrictions. And it has dominated the news for many weeks. And in the middle of it, we had the story this week of Naz Ghani, another value under question, which was that she was told her Muslimness was an issue when she was reshuffled out of a ministerial job. So all this raises the question of values in public life. What are they? What should they be? And how have we got into this position? We have a brilliant and quite large panel to discuss it today. Professor Tina Beattie from the Professor Emeritus from the University of Roehampton, Nick Spencer, Senior Fellow at Theos, Daniel Singleton, the National Director of Faith Action, Qari Asim. Amongst your many titles, Qari, you're a government advisor on the definition of Islamophobia, Dr. Stephen Jones from the University of Birmingham, and the Rev Dr David Muir, also from the University of Roehampton. So thank you all for joining. How this is going to work is, well, I'll ask you all to introduce yourselves and interview you just very briefly on what your main issues are, and then ask you to have a discussion with one another. And those of you on the call, if you have a question for any of the panelists, please put something in the chat box so we know you want to ask it, and we'll have a discussion. So can I turn to you, Tina, first of all, and just put this to you, that in the swirl of press briefings and reports and the emergence of the stories, there's been a great deal of anger, gut reaction from the public to say this is wrong. I wonder if you can tell us what that tells us about British values, where they come from and what they are.
Interesting question. I do want to just begin by saying that this is World Holocaust Day, and having this discussion on such a momentous day that reminds us of the need to be vigilant and aware of the risks we run when political public values begin to slide. Why the outrage over this particular situation? You know, we've had a drip, drip, drip of outrageous situations, including in some ways much more monumental breaches of public trust and honesty than party politics, if I can use that expression. But I think this has impacted very directly in a most hurtful way upon the lives of nearly everybody. I, thank God, don't have stories of bereavement, funerals I couldn't attend, loved ones dying alone. But I do have stories, as everyone does, I think, of cancelled parties and cancelled Christmases, and of knowing our families were struggling to the point almost of nervous breakdown and not being able to go and help. All these things we were willing to do, a cost we were willing to pay for the public good, for protecting ourselves and our neighbours and our loved ones. And now to find that at the very heart of government, where these rules were being issued, there was such flagrant violation of the rules. I think it struck us all in a more intimate and personal way than some of the, in my view, more outrageous breaches of public responsibility and duty that there have been.
Thanks very much, Tina. Can I go to you, Nick Spencer from Theos, because you wrote a blog about this, and I wonder if I could just ask you to pick some of those themes up. Do you think that this is about truth and integrity, or is it hypocrisy?
I guess I wouldn't draw too firm a distinction between the two. I mean, it has to be said that of all the politicians we would expect to be accusing of hypocrisy, I don't think Boris Johnson would be at the top of the list, for the simple reason that you normally throw the accusation of hypocrisy at people who publicly profess a moral code, which they then singularly fail to live up to. I don't think even his worst enemies would accuse Boris Johnson of going through his political career wearing a kind of very public moral mantle in everything he does. It just so happens in this particular instance, it was a very specific series of breaches of norms of behavior that were being imposed on many millions of people at a very significant cost. And so therefore, even though it's not, as it were, generic hypocrisy, it's very specific hypocrisy. More broadly, I think Boris Johnson has a reputation of not telling the truth or being economical with the truth. But in this instance, it's less to do with the truthfulness and more to do with an unwillingness to adopt the same practices, the same very difficult burdens that were being placed on people, and seemingly an indifference to that burden on people. And as Tina said, when people are dying alone because of that, this shifts way away from being a normal kind of political hypocrisy or Westminster hypocrisy type story to something that really is considerably more profound.
In your blog, you make various biblical references, and I'm wondering if you could give us your insight on where you think this moral outrage of the public or the sentiments that you've just been outlining, where they come from in a country that is largely unaffiliated to religion.
So there's a really interesting biblical connection here in that the word hypocrite comes from the Greek word Hippocrates, which basically means performer. It was to do with the masks that people used to wear in Greek theatre. And the analogy I draw is that politics has always been about performance, but it is supremely about performance today, given the ubiquity of coverage, and Boris Johnson is a good performer. But we want more than performers to lead us. Performance has its place, but without integrity and honesty and honour and probity and all those kind of things, it becomes very shallow show. I don't think in any way these are uniquely Christian or Judeo-Christian values. In fact, on the contrary, I would say this was quite a profound natural law issue whereby intrinsically human beings hate hypocrisy. Intrinsically human beings hate that kind of showiness which disguises an indifference to the public good. It just so happens that that is a very clear strand within Christian ethics, but it's not solid, only a Christian ethical stance.
Thank you. Can I now go to Daniel Singleton? So, Daniel, you're the National Director of Faith Action, and you deal very closely with the government on various social justice issues and rolling out of activities right on the front line of society. So, well, first of all, you must have met him, but have you met Boris Johnson? Do you deal with Boris Johnson? Do you deal with number 10 in the Cabinet Office frequently in your work?
More the Cabinet Office than Boris himself. And I'd like to meet him. I'm a historian by background, and I think he's got an interesting take on history. But I think part of the thing is reflecting a little bit on how this is affecting our kind of work, and I think it's almost what Tina was saying right at the start, that this is one issue amongst many, and the main thing that we're faced with at the moment is there seems to be a slight paralysis in government, and there are some big things going on. I mean, we have the issue with Russia and obviously the pandemic and different things like that. And actually, I'm sure many on the call are eagerly waiting for the government to announce what it's going to do about the Faith New Deal, which was trumpeted, and we're still waiting for that a number of months late. So I would say the main effect has not been direct, but one gets the feeling that there's quite a lot of distraction. And that becomes frustrating because it means that we can't move on. It feels we're in a post-pandemic funding round, program round, but it's like a gap. We're between two things and we've not moved on. And I can't help but think that this issue means that there's far too much distraction, and people and ministers and politicians can't get on with the stuff that they should be doing. So those are the kind of things that bear down on us at this point.
Has it shaken your confidence in the people that you have to deal with to make your work happen?
I think I have to note a little bit of cynicism, kind of what Nick said at the start. It's not a real surprise. I think when the dust settles, I think at some point we will go back to discussing what rules were a good idea in the first place, and when people start bending them, and part of the reason is that they're not seen to be of value. I have to say that a lot of this happened a year ago, and yet we're hearing about it now. I think there's a slight thing of the whole thing is it feels like it's part of an anti-Boris kind of campaign. I think it potentially relates even to a sense of not moving on from Brexit or the feelings of Brexit. It feels like it's just fractious, and I think we have a fractious society at the moment, and this feels like it's now working of that. My confidence is, I tell you how my confidence is shaken. I think far too much attention is drawn on these things. And I think there are some really big things that we need to get on, have discussions about. And it might be that heads have to roll to move us on. But really there are bigger things. And exactly as Tina started at the moment, you know, it's Holocaust Memorial Day today. There are some big things that we need to get onto. And all these things link together. But I wouldn't say my is shaken particularly.
Heads must roll. Do you think Boris Johnson's head must roll?
No, I don't think his head must roll. Plus, and I will give the standard response, I think we need to see what the report says in itself. I think it's more to do with the statements that any politician says, the ministerial code and those kind of things. And it's above my pay grade, certainly, to decide that. But I think when I say heads must roll, I'm saying heads may have to roll to move us on. I'm not saying that heads must roll. Particular point.
Get the distinction. We've done lots of stories over the past 18 months, 2 years, about the government working very closely with faith groups in the rollout of social action plans, but the faith groups being quite important to the government in the way that they work. I'm just wondering whether you, amongst the many who do circulate number 10, do you think you have a prophetic voice at the table? Should you say anything?
That's very interesting. I think that we say some things by our action. I think I had a great quote from one of Nick's colleagues recently, and they said that politicians aren't poets. And I think that's I think what we need is people are looking beyond the election cycle, beyond the spending cycle. And I think from a faith perspective, I think those of us who have got hold of some of these justice issues, who are looking at some things, I think that's partly what we should be doing. We should be looking about what can be over the horizon, and trying to, I would say there's a thing of provoking leaders to look beyond the particular media storm they're in at that point. And I would say that's kind of part of the deal that needs to happen there.
Thank you, Daniel. Turning now to Imam Qari Asim. Amongst your many titles, you are the government advisor on the definition of Islamophobia. And in the middle of the controversies over the number 10 parties, we had this story of Naz Ghani saying that Muslimness was put to her as an issue when she lost her job as a transport minister. And you said something about your work with the government, that you had failed to get anyone to engage with you on how Islamophobia should be defined. I just wonder, could you tell us a little bit more about that process and why you feel that that's happening?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, thank you, Ruth, for asking me to join this esteemed panel. So obviously, it was deeply disturbing to hear the claims made by Naz Ghani MP that she was removed from her office or was not offered a position because of her Muslimness, because of her faith. And I think given that today we are marking Holocaust Remembrance Day, it's poignant it's poignant for us to reflect on the fact that people's identity and the protected characteristic became an issue in them either being removed from office or not being promoted or given another job. And then Islamophobia is something that's a lived experience by the Muslim community. There's still some denial about it in certain quarters, that it doesn't exist. But we've seen reports after reports, and even the report by the Birmingham University this week highlights the kind of the alarming levels of anti-Muslim sentiment, either due to ignorance or otherwise, but they actually are lived reality of Muslims and affect Muslims. And so the government recognizes that, because I think the government's own figures, like Home Office, issues hate crime report every year, and every year the report suggests that the the more than half of the religiously motivated hate crime recorded by the government records relate to anti-Muslim sentiment, anti-Muslim hatred. So it's only right that the government announced in 2019 to define Islamophobia, because in order to address it, we have to know what it is that we're trying to address.
Why do you think there's been such lack of progress?
Well, potentially, I think lack of political willingness. So I didn't raise this issue publicly in the last 18 or so months, because obviously we were faced with an unprecedented challenge of COVID. But I think now I hope that the political willingness that's been shown to Nosgani's case is carried across, and we also focus on defining Islamophobia, and the resources are, and appropriate resources are given, and the terms of references are issued for me to start my work of defining Islamophobia, anti-Muslim hatred.
What do you think that whole episode tells you about values in the corridors of power? I mean, we brought you in to talk about it in a discussion that's been triggered by the number 10 parties, but this is about values. What does the episode tell you about values?
It is partly about values. I think it's having the priorities right, in terms of this is something that does not only just affect Muslims. So any form of hatred towards a minority group, also it will be reflected in experiences of other minority groups too. And also I think it just goes to show about integrity and honesty. So interestingly, yesterday a study was done, and then yesterday they said that voters like honesty more than any other trait in a leader. So I would hope that when we're talking about that, we have zero tolerance towards anti-Muslim hatred or any other forms of hatred, then that is reflected in our actions. What Daniel was saying earlier, is walking the talk effectively, and I hope that's done as soon as possible.
Thank you. Do we have Dr. Stephen Jones on the line? So your report this week had the intriguing title of Dinner Table Prejudice. And what you've discovered is Islamophobia around middle-class dinner tables is basically, I think, what your report was about. It's a party, isn't it? I wonder, could you explain what you found in your report and why you labelled it that way, and why you've chosen to categorise it differently to other forms of Islamophobia?
Yes, absolutely, and thanks for having me. It's good to be on this panel. So the phrase, of course, the dinner table prejudice is borrowed from a fairly famous speech from Baroness Saida Barsi made in around 2011. Where she claimed that Islamophobia had, in some sense, sort of passed the dinner table test, in meaning that it was publicly acceptable to say things about Muslims that it would not be publicly acceptable to say about other faith or ethnic communities in the UK. And the report, in essence, is a kind of riff on that, if you will, where what we try and show is two things. One is that the extent amongst the British public of negative attitudes towards Muslims is much higher than it is for the vast majority, not just of religious groups, but ethnic groups too. So every ethnic community that we tested, aside from Gypsy and Irish travellers, who actually come out much worse than any other group. And it's simply to try and make the argument that that is in part because there's a level of tolerance around anti-Muslim prejudice that is not there in public life for most other forms of religious and ethnic prejudice. But there's a more specific thing too, which is what we were trying to do in the report is look very explicitly at how people view prejudice as prejudice about group of people, as opposed to prejudice towards systems of belief. And the reason we drew that distinction is partly due for policy reasons. So I don't know if you've been following the questions about the definition of Islamophobia, but there have been a few published definitions recently by Runnymede, and the most notable by the APPG on British Muslims, that try and argue that Islamophobia is a kind of racism or akin to racism. And we're not arguing against that necessarily. But what we do try and argue in the report is that you can distinguish two distinct types of Islamophobic sentiment by the way they're placed in society. So what we found is that sort of anti-immigration sentiment, the idea of a Muslim ban, for example, or banning certain ethnic or religious communities coming to the UK, that is more popular among working class people within the UK, so lower social and professional occupations as it's classified. But however, when we asked questions that were designed to test prejudice towards religious beliefs, so the idea, for example, that Islam is in some way kind of inherently literalist or inherently fundamentalist, there are no complex traditions of interpretation in Islam, that was a prejudice we found more concentrated amongst upper and middle classes. So really the label of the dinner table prejudice is designed to draw attention to that fact.
Do you think what's gone on in Downing Street is another symptom of a class split? Is it middle class people rejecting rules, laws, behaving in different ways?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not entirely sure. I think there are elements of class in all these kinds of things, and I think the idea that somehow rules don't apply to one group but do apply to others. I think there's wider discussion, and it's interesting watching the news over the weekend and the emergence of this particular story about Nusrat Ghani's allegations about the Conservative Party, now how that sort of fitted into the wider discourse about discontent with Boris Johnson, supposedly at least on the Conservative backbenches. Quite how class fits into that, I'm not entirely sure. We can see it in, I think a lot of the prejudice we have in society is often complexly intertwined with class. So for example, anti-gypsy and travel prejudices, I strongly suspect, we find those much more concentrated amongst upper and middle classes. And I suspect that's because there's a kind of class element to that too. And similarly, Muslim Britons are overwhelmingly much poorer, much more excluded than the British majority. So Islamophobia ties into sort of class issues too. So I think it sort of suffuses everything, but in complex ways that are hard to pull out sometimes.
Thank you. Can I finally go to David Muir, also from the University of Roehampton? David, having listened to all the contributions so far, I wonder if you could just tell us what you feel about the discussion that we've had on values in public life and the response from the public to what they see as brokenness around number 10.
What I find unsettling and unseemly is the fact that we talk a lot about values in public life, and whether it's the Nolan principles. At the time when, as Tina rightly intimated right at the beginning, when the nation had been in collective grief, at the university, we've lost a lot of students, family and friends who couldn't go to their funerals, who couldn't offer that final, the touch, that tactility as someone who's actually, facing their last moments. So that's those critical times. When you find out that government ministers and people in number 10 have been having parties, have been socializing, and they've not been following the rules, I think it actually says to us and to especially young people that, that if you break the rules enough, if you are powerful enough, then you can basically get away with the consequences of rule breaking. I'm mindful that in this week's Economist, there is an editorial about the parable of Boris Johnson. And, that's basically about the fact that as a serial transgressor, he may be getting his comeuppance. But let's wait and see. I was intrigued by what Daniel was saying about being distracted, and there are bigger things. To some extent, I agree with that. But Daniel will know well, there is a biblical thing about the little foxes that spoil the vine. It's these little things. It's a death by 1,000 cuts, isn't it? If you can't trust your prime minister, if you can't trust the people who are supposed to be leading the nation, the people whose steer we will take, I think we're in trouble. And I hear the point about Boris Johnson not being a hypocrite because we have all priced in the fact that we know something about Boris. But what does it say about a nation where we've had cadences of desolation? We've had 2 years of horror, unprecedented horror, to find out that the people right at the very, very top have not been abiding by the rules that all of us have had to abide by. It is unseemly. It is unsettling. And when we talk about the prophetic thing, yes, you know, there are bigger issues and Christians are speaking out. But I think we're almost at a crossroad now where we've got to take accountability in public life a lot more seriously. I guess I'm a bit surprised that more people aren't angry, they're not outraged. It's just, you know, it's a total scandal. Now, yes, we'll all wait for Sue Gray. I suspect Boris, and I do know Boris, I worked with him quite closely when he was mayor of London. I suspect he might be able to talk himself out of this one again, but I'm hoping that there'll be enough MPs in the Conservative ranks who would say, boys, actually enough is enough. And therefore, you know, the final question is, when does a serial transgressor be allowed to transgress even more without there being public and personal consequences? And that's something we've all got to actually look at. So yes, let's see what Sue Gray has got to say. I would hate to be in her shoes, because a lot hangs on what she says and what she doesn't say. How tragic that is for a civil servant to hold that much power in such a critical time of our nation.
Yeah. There's been some criticism that whole process of holding civil servants and government ministers to account is also broken, and that the whole process needs to be reviewed. I wonder, I know that Catherine Pepinster wants to ask a question. I encourage the panelists to have a go at each other as well and discuss your ideas. But Catherine, could you put your question, please?
It's more a comment, but maybe the question should be, what do the panelists think of my comment? People have been talking about anger about what's gone on in Downing Street with these various parties, but I don't think that there is one anger around. I think there are two camps. There's one camp which I suspect most people on this call share, which is that we were all supposed to be together in this, that there was a collective responsibility, and that we were all supposed to abide by the same rules. And then there's another camp, and their view is we should have had much more freedom. We should have been much more able to remain doing what we wanted, being very much individuals. And it's outrageous that we weren't able to do that when the people in Downing Street were able to enjoy themselves in ways the rest of us should have been as well. So I think there's that what this highlights is the tension that we have in society between two different views of how we should be. Should we be working together more in solidarity, or are we a group of individuals? And I think there's there's that tension obviously in politics, but there's a more philosophical tension there between two different camps, seeing how we are. Are we a set of individuals, or are we a society? And when there's such a crisis as COVID or a war, we expect to be more collective, but there are some people who think we should be even then.
I think that underlying philosophical question is really important. And I'm reading a very good book at the moment by Sally Weintraub called The Psychological Roots of the Climate Crisis. And she talks about what neoliberalism has done to us in terms of creating a culture in which we all feel we're exceptions to the rules that apply to the common good. And it kind of pacifies us and soothes us. So every piece of serious news has to be followed by a little joke or a feel-good factor. And by the way, on that note, I really wish we would stop calling the Prime Minister Boris. He is the head of state. He has a position of dignity and responsibility, which befits addressing him in the way that that position demands, whether or not he lives up to it. So the Prime Minister or Boris Johnson. But I think we're in the grip of populism, individualism, and emotivism, fueled by a corporate tabloid press, which does inestimable harm to the public good. And what we lack is this common set of values. Now, I don't want to overestimate that, because shared values, and again, it's World Holocaust Day, shared values by a majority can leave minorities very, very much out in the cold and persecuted. But we do, I'm not talking about British values, but there are certain Western values that have been filtered through a very long history, from Aristotle through medieval theology and philosophy, when it was actually common to Jewish and Muslim and Christian scholars to explore these values of virtue, the good life, what today we might call the common good, and find a kind of shared basis for dialogue and reasoned exchange in the public square. And today, I fear we've cut all those off at the roots. And I do think that has something to do with the very aggressive kind of secularism that often occupies the public square here. I mean, in the United States, you get an aggressive religiosity. In this country, you get an aggressive secularism. In much of Europe, there's a much more fluid kind of dialogue between religious traditions, particularly the Christian, the Catholic tradition, in fact, and secular society. But we do urgently need to find those common values that we can agree upon, where we have something more than the push-button feelings that the tabloid press can induce in people, than the emotivism of, I feel angry, I feel excluded, I feel this, I feel that, all rooted in this radical individualism, so that, you know, what Catherine describes, we get anger firing off, but coming from completely different foundations, with no common language in which to share these questions.
It has to be said that the tabloids have all reported this number 10, the Downing Street Party story, with a sense of outrage. Including papers you wouldn't have expected to have taken that view.
Could I just point out one thing that Tina just said, was that Boris is head of state. He's not actually. The head of state wore her mask and sat alone at her husband's funeral.
Yes.
While there were parties going on at number 10.
Yeah.
Which was a very powerful symbol.
Indeed. Can I go to Ben Rich next? Ben, you've been very active in the chat box. Could you speak in person?
Yeah, there's a couple of points I wanted to make, and I see that that Theodore has gone to a sort of similar place. And the polarization that we've seen in American politics, in which a politician can behave incredibly badly without really losing very much support, is extraordinary and very, very frightening. Actually, I think the good news about the experience the last 2 or 3 months is that there are still consequences for British politicians if you behave in a way that betrays the trust of voters. And so Boris's polling figures have dropped off a cliff. Now, it doesn't mean that people will vote for him, won't vote for him come a general election, or that he doesn't survive. But it means that at least we are still at that point where we haven't so invested in our own separate narratives that we simply can't believe anything bad about our champions or anything good about our opponents. I think that the reason there is outrage is, as I've said in the chat, displacement, but it's around the anger that people feel about different sets of rules, and we are prepared to hold people to account for that. I also wanted just to pick up on a point that I've made about the Tories' attitude to BME and equality issues in the chat, and I'd be interested to hear from people who are able to comment on this. But it seems to me that their political strategy has to be to cherry pick people from the BME community and drop them into safe seats, and often seats with no BME community, not that that matters in the citus, in return for those people then becoming the public face of BME communities within the Conservative Party. But there's nothing within that which addresses issues around inequality within the party itself. And so frankly, I wasn't in the slightest bit surprised by the comments made to Nuz, and neither should she have been.
Thank you, Ben. I don't know if anyone wants to come back on that from the panel.
Yeah, can I just, I mean, yeah, Ben, that was interesting, but you know, I think I am somewhat surprised, and I would be appalled to hear that from a whip, because you know, there are certain public discourse or a level of public discourse that you sometimes articulate, but you don't always express publicly. I'm outraged that if that's what was said about her Muslimness, I mean, that is shocking, because we have a Conservative Party. We heard the Prime Minister saying yesterday at PMQ, when he was asked about equality issues, displaying his cabinet, you know, displaying BME on the front bench. So I do find there's a dissonance going on there.
But David, are you sorry, can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
David, does it make you any more comfortable if the whip in question manages to express the view more tactfully? I mean, my point isn't that the view is in some way acceptable, and yes, it's shocking that they expressed it in that way, but frankly, whether or not it's expressed, nothing that the Conservative Party has done on equalities addresses this way of thinking. So whether they say it or not, it is deeply seated within the party. And yes, having a display of, frankly, black people I can put on my front bench is as far as their commitment to equality currently goes.
Ben and David both make very valid points in terms of that is sometimes the way we express ourselves, which are all what we can display on our front benches. We think that satisfies, or that should satisfy, any criticism leveled regarding equality or by any particular minority. I think that the bottom line is that a lot needs to be done to reassure now, in particular after these scandals and these allegations, if they are, and especially if they're proven to be right, then you know, a lot needs to be done. So I think in the first instance, the Conservative Party can start with robustly and proactively implementing the recommendations that were made in the Singh report that came out last year, and you know, and the Conservative Party at that time readily accepted the recommendations, and at least that will show that actually there's a level of commitment to genuinely do something that's, you know, deeply rooted within the party, and to change that and to make a difference, which is much needed.
Thank you. Can I just go back to Nick Spencer at this point? Nick, we've heard from David a kind of expression of surprise that there hasn't been more anger, and there's a question in the chat box to ask where the bishops are in all of this. We've got Lords Spiritual. Why aren't they speaking out, more of them and more frequently, on this?
Short answer is I don't know. I suspect there's a little bit of anxiety around bishops easily being labelled as Tory bashers, and therefore they are probably a bit reluctant to, although, you know, some of them have spoken out about it. I think that, I mean, I should just pick up on Catherine's point earlier. I think that's one of the most interesting things in all this, that the underlying tension there is across society between, if you like, a solidaristic view and a more libertarian view, and the tensions that perpetually run through society along those lines, and that were evident in the last 2 years or so. I do think that's right, but I also think it's worth casting our minds back to 2 years ago, just shy of 2 years ago, when there were behavioural scientists saying that you can't lock down society like that because people won't obey. And people did. And I'm sure all of us remember a quite remarkable sense of solidarity in different ways exhibited throughout 2020. And I think that is at the heart of why this issue matters so much. It's not just that there is hypocrisy there. It's not just that people were ignoring the rules. It's not just that this was seemingly a cultural issue at number 10, not just under Boris Johnson, but the culture that had seemed to have grown under him. But that was in the context of a kind of a national solidarity, the like of which we have not seen for a very long time. And I think that most people would agree that societies flourish when there is a sense of responsibility to one another. That doesn't obliterate individual freedoms, it mustn't, but they flourish more when there is a sense of, well, I'm going to do this because other people are doing this. I'm making sacrifices because other people are making sacrifices. And we saw that to an exceptional level, and sometimes at very great personal cost in 2020. And it is in that context that this matters so much, because attempts to re-establish significant levels of sacrificial solidarity, again, have been drastically undermined by this story. Can you imagine what it would be like if another variant emerged now that was resistant to the vaccinations we have developed, and we were scrolled back 2 years ago to the fact that the only way we're going to prevent hundreds of thousands of more people dying in intensive care is if we lock down again? Now, God willing, that isn't going to be the case, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility. Quite apart from the side of the fact that people are very, very wary of this anyway. Who in their right mind is going to say, yes, absolutely, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make those sacrifices again, when they know that those who have led us, who have made the rules, are flagrantly ignoring them. And it is that undermining of the impetus and justification for solidarity that I think is the legacy of this particular story, and it's a pretty baleful legacy too.
We're being told everyone in government was working so hard, we were all exhausted. We had a little party because we were really tired. And I just think of those NHS workers, their faces scarred by wearing masks all day and not being provided actually often with the safety equipment they needed. And while our elected leaders were partying because they were exhausted, our health staff were literally sometimes dying on their feet. And that, I think, also rankles very, very deeply. If there is a silver lining to this cloud, I think it is that as a society, we've come to realise how much we value the NHS. And I hope that will translate into resistance to moves to privatise it and deprive our society of one of the great institutions of the post-war era, along with, dare I say, the BBC.
I think just picking up on the wariness, I think that's one thing which is just there. I suspect that those commentators may be right 2 years on, that people won't lock down. Interested to hear about Nick talk about the solidarity. I noticed 2 weeks of quietness, and then things started to rumble differently to where I am, and I think that may be partly to do with a class thing. We've talked about that. I kind of probably live in a more predominantly middle to working class area, and I think that people started to push back a bit, and that's part of the nature of people's work. I think part of the thing in kind of looking ahead is that the Tories have had two very good ideas: the big society and this levelling up. Big society was always a bit too vague, but I think that whereas Boris is kind of been calling, the Prime Minister, Tina, the Prime Minister has been pulling the rabbit out the hat in terms of bread and circuses and vaccine rollouts. That's if this government is not able to deliver on some of those major promises, and I don't think the levelling up is a gimmick. I think you can see roots of it right the way back to Tory democracy and Randolph Churchill and that kind of one nation thing. I think that's going to be the interesting thing. But I suspect there is not enough within the party with a real sense of belief to make that happen. And I think another round of distraction on these things is going to be what we see. I know the fact I don't want to belittle the issues of integrity, but I do think there are some big things that are really people really facing more than these issues that need some approach.
It was quite interesting when you said that you feel there's a certain paralysis in policy across the board. And I wonder how dangerous you feel that is for society shifts and fragmentation in the future.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, everything comes down to money. And we were able to spend a colossal amount of money for things that you know no longer there. You know that we've produced test kits like no tomorrow. If we could have that kind of investment in some of the other things that are longer lasting, make a big difference. But I suspect there's neither the political nor the popular will for some of those things, and we may have spent our treasure now. We've spent it in the short term, and we won't be able to do the borrowing. And I think that means there's a lot of people. It's kind of, we're in a post-war setting, and governments have fallen because they did not provide the homes fit for heroes. Well, are we going to have a Britain fit for the heroes of the pandemic? Is there going to be? It's fascinating to see the NHS was born in the austerity period, you know, when we had no money, and it can be done, but whether we are ready to pay the price is interesting. I think that relates more to what Catherine was saying earlier. Are we willing to collectively pay the price? And it doesn't help when it seemed that some people are playing by a different set of rules.
Thank you. There's a question here from the chat box to Nick. I don't know if you want to ask it yourself, or shall I put it in my own words, Hannah?
Yeah, it was just picking up, Nick, on what you said about about the sense of solidarity we felt in 2020, and how extraordinary that was. And I just wondered whether you feel that through all this, the sense of trust in government, but not just trust in government, a kind of belief in what government is for, has been eroded to such an extent that under another government, would it be possible to ignite that sense of solidarity, do you think? I mean, is it a kind of wider question about government per se?
Oh, that's a really, really good question. So I think that the solidarity to which I was referring was a reaction actually to a sense of fear in the first instance. We're talking back in, what was it, March the 23rd, I seem to recall, back in 2020, and then the following 2 months after that. This was the time that, in Dominic Cummings' famous word, the Department of Health was like a smoking ruin. I don't know how seriously one takes Dominic Cummings, but I suspect that's probably quite true. There was a sense that we don't know what we're facing. We don't have any tools to combat it. And the best advice we have, and we don't know how good that is that we need to stay indoors and make these sacrifices. And we did. And we did, I think, to an extent, as I said, that many behavioural scientists thought that, well, they're very unlikely to. I don't think government did a great deal to undermine that sense of solidarity, even if the Department of Health was a smoking ruin, because it was such an uncertain time. I think people were willing to cut government quite a lot of slack. And in a similar way, 10, 12 months later, with the rollout of a vaccine program that was very widely considered to be very professional and a world leader, there was a kind of solidarity that was, in that instance, founded on trust in government. So at its best, there was a solidarity that was there because of our circumstances and there because of government. But I think this story has badly eroded the latter. And as Catherine pointed out at the beginning of our conversation, there are always these tensions underlining between, solidarity and individualism in society. And all of us on this discussion have praised solidarity, as you would expect, but nonetheless, we live in a liberal society in which people have the choice to, say what they like and do what they like within reason. And that's one of the things we value about it. So I don't think it's been undermined permanently, but I do think that were we to face a similar challenge again, it would be difficult to work up quite the same level of solidarity. And I do think, going back to my previous point, a lot of that has to do with these late revelations that at the time when we were at our most solidaristic, those who should have been weren't.
But is it this government, or does that mean any government. I mean, we're in real trouble, aren't we, if going forward, if another government is in place, the mistakes that, you know, that erosion is continued through the whole idea of government completely.
So this government won't have changed the course of travel very significantly, I have to say. I used to work many years ago at the Henley Centre, and they had a trust barometer, effectively, which measured the level of public trust in institutions across society from the early 1980s. Pretty much every single one of them has been on a continuous slide for 40 years or so. Some admittedly started from a pretty low base already. Interestingly, the two that haven't, two of the exceptions are medical attention and NHS and military, and also the monarchy. But certainly government has been on a downward trajectory. This would have just increased that. It won't have made a significant difference. But I would also say, just as a final point, we like to say we don't trust things. And that's why the behavioural scientists 2 years ago said, well, they're not going to trust government telling them to stay at home. So what we actually say about the extent to which we trust government, period, and what we finally do when, you know, the chips are down aren't necessarily the same thing.
Thank you, Nick. We're coming into the closing minutes of the call, and I want to bring in Stephen Patterson. If you can show us your face, Stephen. You're there in the background, and you've just written in the chat box something about the sense of people being, we are fickle creatures, was the way that you put it. Just because you're listening to the whole hour, could you just summarise what your reflections are on, well, values in British society?
Well, I've just written in the chat box, the language of values really came to, it seems to have displaced the values of ethics. And it is a particular language. It's actually a language we use for certain purposes to get a certain kind of moral high ground, it seems to me, in a democratic society where, you know, the language of ethics and the language of religion has been displaced. So we now talk about the language of values, but the language of values changes. So I once did some work with managers in the health service who swore blind that their values had never changed over 20 or 30 years, because that's the nature of values. A value isn't a value if it changes. But actually, you could see precisely from the way they talk that their language and the way they thought about values had indeed changed over 20 or 30 years, and that's exactly what you'd expect. But the function of the language of values was to sort of make a claim that this is something that doesn't change, and that then makes it more authoritative in much the same way as religious language used to work. So I worry about values, the language of values, because I think sometimes it disguises more complex discussions. I wish I knew how we could have those more complex discussions, but I think sometimes the language of values just feeds into this feeding frenzy of who are we, where are we going to go? We can't get rid of it, we've got to use it, we've got to be aware of it, but it's in some ways doesn't help us terribly much. You know, the truth is we had this moment of optimism in 2020 where we thought, well, we're never going to go back to the way we were, and lo and behold, the language of liberalism and capitalism and individualism sort of seems to be running rife again. So I'm kind of, we need a more subtle analysis of this, but you'd expect me to say that as an academic, and it's probably not a very helpful comment.
But I'm wondering where that leaves this discussion, because if values come and go, and we're talking about values in British society, should the government be pulled up not on values, but on their ethical foundation? I don't know, what words would you use?
I think it would be very useful if we had some sort of public discourse about ethical foundations, because I think values is too blunt an instrument. I think values gets tied up with identity. And when you're talking about identity, you're talking about hurt and you're talking about emotions. I sometimes think that values are a bit like door stoppers. You don't realize you have them until you fall over them, and then you hurt yourself, and then you realize that you believe profoundly in something that hurts you. And I think that we are so respectful of other people's hurt that we perhaps don't get through to actually really talking about the things we agree about and the things we disagree about. And that's a complicated discussion, and it's not an easy one for us to have. And it's certainly not an easy one for this particular government to have, because it deals in block colours and big emotions, it seems to me.
So is the problem with all of this the lack of religious affiliation? That if there was religious affiliation, there would be clear ethical foundations?
I don't think you can religious affiliation has become such a kind of not everybody is affiliated, even people who are affiliated in different ways. We are living in a diverse culture, and there is no going back to some hypothetical place where we all knew who we were and what we were doing. That is one of the illusions of values, that it sort of suggests that there is that such a place. What we are in is a complex world where we all have to learn about each other and work together, and that's a difficult grown-up adult task. And in a world where politicians are parents and we are children, we find it very difficult to kind of engage with that sort of process, it seems to me.
Right, thank you.
Sorry to be a miserabilist.
I've discovered all kinds of departments of religion, ethics, philosophy. They've got different names all over the UK, and it's interesting to hear the kind of discussion that goes on there. Thank you very much, everyone. It was a complex discussion, and the Sue Gray report is not out yet. So when it comes out next week, we may have to go through all this again. So do keep in touch with us and join us for the next one. But thank you very much to the panelists for taking part, and for all of you for joining in. Thanks very much, and see you next week.